Chapter 20. A stranger at the door. After Caleb reported the unfortunate news, they began wandering again, hoping to find some place they could stay, but with each passing inn and tavern the mess of soldiers and ghouls only increased and their hopes slowly faded. Caleb noticed Layla faltering in her steps, and shivering against the cold that wound its way between the walls of the houses. He offered his arm to help her, which she took gratefully with a weak smile. "Blast it all," Anselm spit. "I'm ready to walk into plain sight, march up to the first inn we see, and demand a room even if we have to trounce every last person inside the building to get it." "For once, brother," Elastra said, "I think you're right." Caleb was entertaining similar thoughts, but he kept silent. "Our options grow thin, but I will die fighting before falling captive to the likes of them again," Leothrin said, with a sharp tone thick with her accent from her fatigue. She mumbled something indistinct in her own tongue. Her eye flashed its golden glimmer like a cat in the dark, and Caleb was glad he had gone alone into the tavern. Despite her beauty, she could in fact look frightening to a stranger. After a time they stumbled upon one street that left the dark neighborhoods to go inward more toward the city center and the shoreline. It was a broad roadway, stone-paved and well-lit, and was lined with bigger buildings. Most of them were shops closed and darkened for the night, but there were also 2 inns visible. Aside from 1 or 2 silent figures wandering outside each of them, the road was empty. "Well, this is as good a place as any to stop," Caleb said. He turned to look back at his companions, and his eyes went straight to a small shadow creeping up behind them from the darkness. It was coming straight at Elastra, who at that point stood at the back of their huddle. The sudden expression on Caleb's face made them all turn, and in the next second they sprang into action. Caleb pushed Layla behind him and watched it all happen. He didn't see Leothrin draw her dual swords, but they were in her hands instantly. Elastra impulsively jumped off to the side, and Anselm dodged behind the shadow and threw his arm around its neck in a chokehold. A helpless yelp came from the figure as Anselm pulled it to the wall, and the Satyr placed her blades on its chest, poised to plunge at the slightest movement. All 4 of the horses reeled in fright at the sudden surprise, and Caleb and Layla managed to get them under control before they could kick. Elastra held out one hand in a first-degree hex formation, and a small ball of light pulsed forward, revealing their stalker and casting long shadows on the building walls. Their assailant was a young man, perhaps in his later teen years, with a head of black scruffy hair and big ears. He was quite unshaven, and his clothes were that of the lowest class, dirty and worn down by years of long use, bearing many signs of improvised repair. As the small light lit the alley, his face became wholly visible. His eyes were giant circles, and his face had a stamp of complete terror, as if he were looking into the eyes of fate himself. He shook his head violently and tried to protest the shapeshifter's blades pressing his chest, but only short breaths and squeals came out. "What is this?" Elastra sneered. "We don't have any money if that is what you are after," Layla said, guessing at his intention. No money," the boy managed to get out. "No. I don't want money, no ma'am, please." The shock of being stolen upon faded, and Leothrin sheathed her swords and walked away. The fact that she turned her back to him was a sure sign he was not dangerous. She was shaking her head, and Caleb thought he caught an annoyed smile playing on her lips. "Ansel," Caleb said. "It's all right." He released his grip and the boy clutched his throat and gasped for air. "Sorry about that," Caleb said to the boy. "But you should probably know that creeping up on an armed group in the night is not the wisest venture, especially when there are 5 of us and you haven't a weapon yourself." "You're not a very good thief, are you?" Layla said, almost sympathetically. The boy finally caught his breath again, and was clutching his chest in an attempt to calm himself. "I am sorry," he finally said. "I didn't mean to frighten you all, but I had to make sure you weren't with them." "Well, I believe there is no longer any doubt about that." "Them? You mean the Talgothians?" Elastra asked. The boy nodded and clutched his knees to take a few more deep breaths. "Right. Well, if you're not after money, what do you want from us?" said Caleb. His patience was wearing thinner by the minute. He was still determined to get them all somewhere safe where they could rest properly, especially Layla. Even the horses were fatigued. "You came through the gate by the cattle stalls, didn't you?" "It took me a while before I realized it." I was further down the wall and thought I had heard something. When I found the lock had been broken, I knew I had missed you. But what luck! It's harder than you would think to keep track of even a group of your size through these streets at night. Elastra came nearer and leaned in close to him, eyes glaring. You're not making any sense, boy. Are you a spy for the invaders? His eyes grew frightened again as they darted back and forth from her scowl to her light emanating hand. Oh no. I was born and raised here in Manon, I promise. Right here in Shorewell. The name is Cliff. He looked down at her hand again. Why, you bear the scar of the warden in your palm. If I'm not mistaken, I was sent to find you. Is one of you called Caleb? Elastra stood up straight and looked back at him in surprise along with the rest of them. I am Caleb, he said as he walked over to the boy. What of it? Did someone send you to find me? Cliff dropped his head and let out a long sigh of relief, and his body visibly relaxed and loosened. Oh good, he said. I don't know how many more guesses I could have lived through. This guess was the most frightening of all. He glanced at Leothrin again. I have been looking for you for quite some time. A man came to the city from the north about the same time the Talgothians marched in and hired me and some others to watch the wall for your entrance. Paid me a lot more than I could ever have hoped to earn down at the port too. They all looked at Caleb and smiled. I knew my father would come through, he thought. Damon's legendary cunning was certainly alive and well. An older man with a moustache and beard? Caleb asked. The boy nodded. That's right. And he wears a cap with a feather on the side most of the time. Calls himself Rembrandt and won't tell me much more than that. Caleb strode to the boy and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. The boy flinched. Well met, Cliff, Caleb said to him. You've delivered the message well. Can you take us to him then? Wish I could, the youth responded with another sigh. I'm afraid I don't know where he is. I was only ordered to take you to the Anchor Inn and to tell you to wait there. An inn? Layla asked with a new energy in her voice. That's right, said Cliff. Only, Rembrandt said he was expecting 1 or perhaps 2 companions with Mr. Caleb, and here there are 5. He whistled and ran his gangly hand through his hair. It might be a little tight. There are only 2 rooms and they are small. That will do, Caleb said. Cliff, lead the way. The young man nodded and took the lead at the head of their party. He led them cautiously out from the back streets and into the larger roads along the side, where the shadows helped to conceal them. He stopped them several times as they worked their way inward to run ahead and check around new corners. Clearly avoiding invaders. He has been well instructed. But I wonder how much Father told him. Seems he doesn't know where any of us are from. The Anchor wasn't far. As they moved through the city, they only had to backtrack once when their path was suddenly blocked by a group of ghouls and men pouring out of a tavern door into the street in some kind of brawl. They only took 2 of the larger, well-lit roads before returning again to the darker residential ones. Caleb could see the spire of the Flagstaff Manor peeking above the rooftops, and noted that they must be in the dead center of the city proper. The night was deep when they finally saw the inn come into view. It was fairly small compared to the others they had seen. It was built with sturdy wood, and like most of the structures in Shorewell had a domed roof. A large sign hung horizontally into the street from above 2 wide doors, painted with a picture of an anchor entwined with rope with fish spread all around its base. As odd as it was, it looked very inviting to the weary group. Cliff led them past the front. They all glanced cautiously into the wide window as they went to see more of the invaders' recruits eating and drinking, although it was far less crowded and boisterous than others they had encountered. Are you sure he said to take us here, boy? Elastra asked. Surely all the rooms are taken and we need privacy. Cliff turned to her and winked. This way, if you will. He led them around the corner of the building through an old worn fence into a narrow walkway. They marched single file, pulling their horses behind them in order to fit. When they reached the back, they found themselves in a small grassy area surrounded by the same high expiring fence. The only thing occupying the space was an old stable with a thatched roof that looked barely big enough for a tack room, and a few stalls. I'll take your animals from here. 2 of them will have to share a stall, I'm afraid, but the other two can have their own. I believe the innkeeper knows to have them fed and brushed. I'll let him know you're here." He shuffled to the back of the inn to a cracked door barred with a wooden beam. "This is the back door, but it leads down to the bottom floor of the inn. There are other rooms down there with guests, but since this way is no longer in use, you should be able to go in without being seen. The first 2 doors on the right are for you." He lifted the beam and heaved it into the tall spike weeds beside the door. As he opened it, it protested with a loud creak from years of neglect, revealing a staircase leading downward with the soft glow of lantern light pulling them in. "Let's see," Cliff said to himself, counting on his fingers. "Yes. I think that's all I was supposed to do. Rembrandt directed you to wait here for his return. Now I'll get your horses inside, and then I have to be off to make my report at my post." Cliff hastily led their animals into the stable and helped them carry their saddlebags down to the doors of the room, then with a bow and a farewell was gone, shutting the back door behind him. They all dragged their baggage inside the first room and shut the door. It was small, just as Cliff had said, about 20 spans across and 30 wide, and was sparsely furnished with 2 beds, a small table with 2 chairs, and a wash basin in one corner with a mirror on top. The only decoration was a large painting on the wall of a seaside view below rocky cliffs. The lighting, 2 fat candles sitting in old metal sconces on the far wall, provided mediocre visibility, but it was sufficient enough. They were pleased to find that another door in the room connected the neighboring room with theirs, and naturally, the 3 women carried their possessions into it. "It will be nice to have a bed to sleep on again to help with these aching muscles," Elastra said, rubbing her lower back. "I don't ride enough." Layla let out a sigh. Caleb couldn't quite tell if it was from fatigue, or because she would be sharing the space with Elastra. "We'd best get all of the rest we can tonight," Caleb said as he removed his cloak and unfastened the sword from his belt. "I'm sure my father will meet us tomorrow, and there's no telling what news he could bring. A week from now we could be anywhere." Leothrin was in the next room with the other women, looking at her face in the mirror and feeling her eye patch with a frown. She still had not removed any of her travel gear. Elastra and Layla, on the other hand, were sitting on the edge of the beds, their cloaks and boots already strewn about the room. "Caleb," Elastra said, "I must heal that wound on your face. Come." Layla failed at hiding a scowl but said nothing, as it meant Caleb's pain would be relieved. Caleb had almost forgotten the slash he had received from the Fendara, and the burning returned almost instantly now that it was brought to his attention again. He could feel traces of dried blood along the line it followed from his forehead down across his nose. Elastra slid over to make room for him on the bed. She laid her hands over the wound, forming a hex, and closed her eyes. Caleb closed his eyes also as he felt the hex energy binding the wound closed. It was warm and he could see light through his eyelids. It felt as if the cut had been reversed, following the course it had taken when he had received it, as if time were being called back or erased somehow. He mused at the world his friends knew and the powers they harnessed. "Not for me. I do not understand the workings of hexes. I do not know if I have enough trust to surrender parts of my subconscious to an order of deities, even if it does bring great power. All I need is a sword and shield." The healing was done soon, and he opened his eyes. He couldn't be sure, but it seemed that Elastra held her hand on his cheek a little longer than necessary before she smiled and slid back. "How do you feel?" Layla asked, standing beside him. She touched his face and was surprised to find that the only trace of the wound was a small scar on the top of his nose. "I feel better," he responded, following with his own hand where she was touching, giving her hand a playful squeeze. He walked to the mirror and looked, smiling approvingly. "Thank you, Ella. You are a marvel." "Think nothing of it." She was already sprawled out on the bed with her arms behind her head, and nodded self-confidently. "You had better keep your records, Elle," Anselm called from the other room. Caleb could see him through the open door sitting at the table and writing in his own book. "I have an extra ink bottle and pen if you need it," he said with an annoyed tone. "That is, if you have enough memories left in your brain to record." She ignored him. Leothrin had finally removed her weapons and cloak, and was working on her boots. Caleb started to think he would go outside again, and look for a well to use to fill their water basins when suddenly a knock came at the door of the first room. They all looked up in surprise. "The innkeeper," Layla whispered. Anselm put down his pen and started for the door, but at the last minute Caleb stopped him. "Wait, Ansel." In a brief moment they all understood. In the comfort of the inn, they had nearly forgotten to be cautious. "It could be your father." "Or the innkeeper," Alastra whispered. Caleb crossed into the other room and stopped in front of the door. Anselm stood by his side, and the women crowded the connecting door, listening silently. "Yes." "Who is it?" Caleb asked. There was a moment of silence before a strange voice came from the other side. The deep and raspy voice, like a loud whisper, sent chills through Caleb's spine, but there was also an odd hint of elegance behind it that made him wonder if it really was the innkeeper after all. "Good evening and forgive my disturbance," the stranger said. "I am looking for a friend." Caleb and Anselm both raised their eyes to the top of the door where the voice had come from. A man that tall? It couldn't be. Looking back at the others, he could tell they were all thinking the same thing. "I am sorry," Caleb responded to the door, making sure the pause was not long enough to be suspicious. "I am a traveler, and do not know anyone in this city." "I see," came the raspy voice. "I am also a traveler. Perhaps we can talk of our journeys together. You may know my friend after all." All of the companions looked at each other suspiciously again. Leothran had not moved, but she had drawn her dagger. Elastra was glaring at the door, and Layla looked no less intent. "Perhaps another time," Caleb said. Anselm nodded in assent. "I am very tired and must get my rest. Perhaps one of the other more informed guests or the innkeeper could assist you." Nothing came from the other side of the door. Caleb waited a moment before he placed his ear softly to the wood, listening. He could hear rustling and deep breathing. And mumbling. "What does he want from us?" Anselm slipped away from the door as quietly as he could, and crept to where Caleb had left his sword leaning against the wall by the bed. He took it and returned, slipping it into Caleb's hand. "Is there anything else I can help you with?" Caleb said, this time more commanding and ready to draw. "Invaders have come to these lands from the east," said the voice after a time. "If you have a moment to spare, surely we could talk briefly of what we have seen to the benefit of us both." Madness. Caleb thought. "You're not coming in. If you do, it will be your death." "I must sleep. Good night," Caleb said. Another long pause. "We can speak at a later day," the odd voice said at last. "Forgive my disturbing you all." There was not another word from the hallway. Caleb listened again. No rustling. No breathing. He locked the door and stood up straight, his hand easing off of the hilt of his sword. "He is gone." Layla ran to the door to their room and locked it quickly. "It was him. The man Layla and I saw last night." "I know it," Caleb stated. They gathered at the adjoining door and spoke softly. "But how can you be sure?" Elastra asked. "The man from the other night apparently sent those beasts after us. If this was the same man, then why did he not kick in the door and kill us all?" "I don't know, but he certainly knew we were here." "Forgive me for disturbing you all," Caleb quoted. Even though I am the only one who spoke, he knew I was not alone. "And there can only be so many people in Manon as tall as he," Anselm remarked sarcastically. "You think he tried enough pretenses to get in here? None of this makes any sense." "That was him all right," Layla agreed. "I am sure of it also." She seemed to be off in a daze as she spoke. "Father, where are you? We can wait no longer for these answers." "Well, let's try to get some rest," Caleb said. "Ansel and I will keep watch on the door in case we get any more unwelcome visitors." "And I will do the same for our door," Leothran said, sheathing her dagger. "Besides, there are only 2 beds and I can sleep just as well on a chair. No one will enter this night. We had best stay hidden. We can eat what is left of our provisions and fetch some water from the wells for washing in the morning," Caleb suggested. They all agreed, and separated to their own rooms for the night, closing the middle door between them most of the way for privacy, but leaving a small crack just in case something did happen. Anselm removed his belt and warden robes and hung them on a hook on the wall with his satchel, then went back to the table to finish the last of his entry for the day in his breeches and loose white undershirt. Caleb also stripped down to his breeches and emptied his pockets onto the bed. A few spare coins came first, then some extra leather ties for his weapons, and lastly the ring he still carried. He took it to Anselm and placed it on the table beside his journal. "Remember this." Anselm squinted at it and then remembered. "Ah. The ring. I'd forgotten. You never gave it to her then, I suppose," he added in a hushed tone. Caleb leaned on the wall next to the table and eyed the door to the other room as he responded. "Ever since Grimhall, the world seems thrown into chaos. I never took the chance to give it to her, and I guess I never will. I suppose that solves my problem then," he chuckled sadly. Anselm finished the sentence he was writing and shut the book without marking his place. He put his quill pen down and thought for a moment with his hands cupped around his mouth. "Fate's will is a strange thing, my friend. But with all that has happened to us, it seems like too much to be just chance. Fate willed us to be here, willed us to find Leothran. I think things will all turn out as they should." "Since when are you optimistic, Ansel?" Caleb asked with a grin. Anselm snorted, then stood up and stretched. "Since I rode for 2 days straight with hardly any sleep. I must be going mad." Caleb picked up the ring, looking through it like a spyglass in thought. He glanced at the door to Layla's room. "Love can still be hopeless sometimes, no matter how deep its roots," Anselm said, sounding more like his cynical self. He extinguished one of the candles and lay down on the bed. "You'll know what you desire in time. That is, if we survive a night in a city full of Talgothians and gangly evil strangers." He shivered and rolled over. "To think a gruel could very well be sleeping above us. Wake me when you get tired and I'll switch places with you." Caleb put the ring with the rest of his things and blew out the last candle. As he sat on the edge of his bed with his sheathed sword in hand, he listened to the women's indistinguishable whispers until those too gave way to silence. His soldier's mind would keep him awake no matter how tired he was, at least enough to hear unnatural noises, but his thoughts lingered in a state somewhere between sleep and consciousness. Thoughts of the day's events swirled with memories of their journey and the battle at Tritus, which melted into thoughts of his father and Layla. Why did I ever agree for her to come with us? Just coming to Shorewell has proved much more dangerous than I ever imagined. And now here we are surrounded by the invaders. I'll put a stop to all of this. I must. Fate's will or no, I will see to it that they march no further into the Westerlands and answer for their tyranny. As for Grimhall, I will wash the stain of King Roland's blood from my hands yet." Despite his intentions, Caleb did fall asleep hours later, sitting with the sword sheath still clutched in his hands.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Episodes go live every Monday and Friday morning at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The audiobook can be purchased in its entirety on Google Play Books. Get the whole trilogy now in both paperback and ebook formats. All links are in the description.